Commander Sarah Chen stood at the viewport of the transport vessel, watching Earth grow larger as they approached humanity's homeworld. The blue marble looked peaceful from space, but Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. After 15 years commanding the 7th Human Defense Fleet against the Zephyrian invasion, she had learned that the most dangerous battles often came disguised as something harmless. The transport shuddered slightly as it entered Earth's atmosphere. Sarah's cybernetic left arm, a souvenir from the Battle of Titan's Gate, automatically adjusted to maintain her grip on the rail. Around her, other soldiers were preparing for planetfall, but none carried themselves with the same weight she did. She was the youngest fleet commander in human history, the woman who had broken the Zephyrian siege at Europa, and the architect of humanity's greatest military victory in 3 centuries. But today, she wasn't returning as a hero. She was returning as a student. The Global Education Council had made it clear during her debriefing on Luna Station. Despite her military achievements, despite commanding fleets that numbered in the thousands, despite being responsible for saving human colonies across 3-star systems, Sarah Chen had never completed her formal education. She had been recruited into the military academy at 14, fast-tracked through officer training, and thrust into command during humanity's darkest hour. Now that the war was over, the bureaucrats had decided she needed to finish what she had started. High school. Sarah's reflection in the viewport showed a woman who looked older than her 29 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation military style, revealing the thin scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, another gift from the Zephyrians. Her brown eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had made life-and-death decisions while others her age were worried about term papers and dating. The dress uniform she wore carried enough medals to weigh down a smaller person, each one representing battles that had shaped the course of human civilization. The transport touched down at the New Geneva spaceport with barely a bump. Sarah gathered her single duffel bag, everything she owned that wasn't military property, and prepared to disembark. The other passengers gave her respectful nods as she passed. Everyone knew who she was. Her face had been on every news broadcast for the past year, ever since she had personally led the assault on the Zephyrian flagship. The spaceport was bustling with the usual mix of travelers, traders, and tourists. Sarah had expected to blend into the crowd, but she had forgotten how much attention her uniform drew. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Some pointed. A few even started to approach her before thinking better of it. She made her way to the civilian transport terminal, where a hover car was waiting to take her to her destination. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair, did a double-take when he saw her. "You're Commander Chen," he said, his voice filled with awe. "My son served under you at Proxima Base." Sarah nodded politely. She had learned to accept these encounters gracefully, even though they made her uncomfortable. "What's his name?" "Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Engineering Corps." Sarah's enhanced memory, another military modification, immediately brought up the file. "Good officer. His work on the shield generators saved a lot of lives." The driver beamed with pride as they lifted off. "He always said you remembered everyone in your command. Every single person." The flight to Riverside Academy took 40 minutes, giving Sarah time to review the files the Education Council had provided. Riverside was one of Earth's most prestigious educational institutions, a place where the children of diplomats, corporate executives, and government officials completed their studies. It was also, according to the files, completely unprepared for someone like her. The academy sat on a hill overlooking Lake Geneva, its classical architecture a stark contrast to the utilitarian military bases Sarah was used to. Manicured gardens surrounded elegant stone buildings that had stood for over 2 centuries. Students in crisp uniforms walked between classes, their biggest worry apparently whether they would pass their upcoming exams. Sarah's hovercar landed in the administrative parking area. She thanked the driver, who refused payment, and instead asked for an autograph for his son. As she walked toward the main building, Sarah noticed how the other students stopped to stare. Her military bearing made her stand out like a battleship among pleasure craft. The main office was a study in old-world elegance, with wooden panels and leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. The receptionist, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 50s, looked up from her holographic display with practiced politeness. "May I help you?" "Commander Sarah Chen reporting for enrollment." The woman's professional smile faltered slightly. She consulted her display, scrolled through several screens, and then looked back at Sarah with barely concealed confusion. "I see. You're the special student. Principal Morrison is expecting you." Sarah was escorted down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, most of whom had gone on to careers in politics or business. None of them, she noticed, had ever been shot at by alien energy weapons or had to make split-second decisions that determined whether entire colonies lived or died. Principal Morrison's office was even more intimidating than the reception area. The man himself was tall and thin, with silver hair and the kind of condescending smile that Sarah had learned to distrust in politicians. He stood as she entered, extending a hand that felt soft and weak compared to the calloused grips of the soldiers she was used to. "Commander Chen, welcome to Riverside Academy. I must say, this is quite unprecedented." Sarah remained at attention. "Thank you for accommodating the Education Council's request, sir. Please sit down. We have much to discuss." Morrison settled behind his massive desk and consulted a tablet. "I've reviewed your file, and I must admit I'm somewhat at a loss. You're clearly an accomplished military person, but academically speaking, you're still technically a sophomore. Your last formal education was at the age of 14, and while your military training is impressive, it doesn't fulfill our graduation requirements." "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to complete whatever coursework is necessary." Morrison looked skeptical. "Commander, I don't think you appreciate the challenges ahead. Academic life is very different from military life. Here we value critical thinking, cultural awareness, and social development. It's not just about following orders or winning battles." Sarah felt her jaw clench slightly, but she kept her voice level. "I'm aware that there will be adjustments to make. The Education Council has made it clear that you're to be treated like any other student. No special accommodations, no preferential treatment. You'll attend classes, complete assignments, and take exams just like everyone else. You'll also be required to participate in extracurricular activities and maintain our behavioral standards." The principal paused, studying Sarah with the kind of look she had seen from enemy commanders trying to assess her capabilities. "I'll be honest, Commander. Many of our students come from very privileged backgrounds. They can be challenging for someone who isn't used to their social dynamics. Military discipline won't help you navigate teenage politics." Sarah almost smiled at that. Morrison had no idea what she had faced in the diplomatic chambers of 36 alien species, or how she had managed to keep together a coalition of human colonies that had spent centuries fighting among themselves. But she simply nodded. "I appreciate your concern, sir." Morrison handed her a schedule printed on actual paper, something Sarah hadn't seen since her childhood. "Your dormitory assignment is included. Classes begin tomorrow morning. I've arranged for you to have a student guide to help you adjust." As Sarah left the administrative building, she reflected on the irony of her situation. She had faced down Zephyrian battle cruisers without flinching, had negotiated peace treaties with species whose thought processes were literally alien to humanity, and had reorganized the entire human defense strategy from the ground up. But the prospect of sitting through algebra class and navigating the social hierarchies of privileged teenagers felt more daunting than any of those challenges. The dormitory was a 4-story building that looked like it belonged in a historical drama rather than a modern educational facility. Sarah's room was on the 2nd floor, a modest space with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window that looked out over the lake. One side of the room was already occupied, decorated with posters of pop stars and actors that Sarah didn't recognize. She was unpacking her few belongings when the door burst open. A girl with bright purple hair and enough jewelry to set off metal detectors bounced into the room, stopped short when she saw Sarah, and let out a small shriek. "Oh, my stars, you're her! You're the Commander Chen, the one who saved humanity!" Sarah turned slowly. The girl couldn't have been more than 17, with the kind of energy that reminded Sarah of a plasma reactor running at maximum output. She was also staring at Sarah like she had just met her childhood hero. "I'm Sarah. You must be my roommate." "Kira Okafor! I can't believe this. My parents are going to flip when I tell them I'm rooming with the hero of Europa. Can I get a selfie? My followers are never going to believe this." Before Sarah could respond, Kira had produced a phone and was attempting to position herself for a photo. Sarah gently but firmly moved the device away. "I'd prefer to keep a low profile if possible." Kira's face fell slightly, but her enthusiasm didn't dim. Right, of course. Military operational security and all that. I totally get it. Oh, but can I at least tell people who you are? I mean, everyone's going to know anyway once they see you in class." Sarah sat down on her bed, suddenly feeling very tired. "They can know who I am. I just don't want to make a big production of it." "This is so incredible." Kira plopped down on her own bed, legs crossed like a child at story time. "I have about 1,000,000 questions. Is it true you actually fought a Zephyrian commander in hand-to-hand combat? Did you really figure out how to reprogram their shield frequencies in the middle of a battle? Is your arm really cybernetic?" The questions came rapid-fire, and Sarah realized that her new roommate represented her first real challenge at Riverside Academy. How do you explain to someone who had never seen real violence what it was like to watch good people die? How do you describe the weight of command to someone whose biggest responsibility was probably remembering to charge their phone? "The stories are usually exaggerated," Sarah said carefully. "But some of them are true, right? I mean, you did save Earth. You did win the war." Sarah looked out the window at the peaceful campus below. Students were walking to dinner, laughing and talking about whatever 17-year-olds talked about these days. None of them had ever seen a planet burning. None of them had ever had to write letters to the families of people who had died under their command. "We won," she said quietly. "But it wasn't just me. A lot of good people made it possible." Kira seemed to sense that she had hit a sensitive topic. "Well, anyway, I'm really excited to have you as a roommate. I can show you around, introduce you to people, help you figure out how things work here. It's going to be amazing." As Kira continued chattering about campus life, social groups, and upcoming events, Sarah began to understand what Principal Morrison had meant about challenges. The military had prepared her for many things, but it hadn't prepared her for the enthusiastic goodwill of a teenager who saw her as a celebrity rather than a person. Dinner was served in a grand hall that looked like it belonged in a castle. Sarah found herself in a cafeteria line for the first time in over a decade, holding a tray and trying to decide between various food options that seemed unnecessarily complicated. In the military, you ate what was served and were grateful for it. The dining hall fell silent as she entered. Hundreds of students turned to stare at the woman in the simple civilian clothes who moved with the precise gait of a career soldier. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone dropped their fork. Kira, oblivious to the attention, led Sarah to a table where several other students were sitting. "Everyone, this is my roommate Sarah. Sarah, meet Jake, Melissa, Chen, and Rodriguez." The introductions were awkward. The students clearly knew who she was, but none of them seemed to know how to talk to her. Finally, Jake, a tall boy with the kind of confidence that suggested wealthy parents, leaned forward. "So, Commander, what's it like killing aliens?" The table went silent. Even Kira looked horrified. Sarah set down her fork and looked directly at Jake, her expression unreadable. "I've never killed anyone because they were alien," she said quietly. "I've killed people because they were trying to kill me and the people I was sworn to protect. Species didn't matter." Jake's smirk faded rapidly. I didn't mean... "The first person I ever killed was human," Sarah continued, her voice steady and calm. "A pirate captain who was about to execute a ship full of civilian refugees. I was 16. I still remember his name." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Melissa, a girl with kind eyes, spoke up. "That must have been really hard." Sarah looked at her, surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. "It was necessary." The conversation gradually moved to safer topics, but Sarah noticed that the other students kept glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. She was clearly a puzzle they couldn't solve, something that didn't fit into their carefully organized social categories. After dinner, Kira gave her a tour of the campus. The library was impressive, with both digital archives and actual physical books. The science laboratories were well equipped, though nothing compared to the research facilities on military ships. The athletic facilities were extensive, designed for students who had time to worry about physical fitness for its own sake, rather than as a survival necessity. "So tomorrow you'll have calculus first period with Mr. Thompson," Kira explained as they walked. "He's pretty cool, doesn't give too much homework. Then you have Galactic history with Professor Martinez. She's tough but fair. After that is comparative literature, which is basically just reading old books and talking about feelings." Sarah nodded, trying to process the schedule. It had been years since she had worried about homework or test grades. Her last exam had been a tactical simulation where failure meant the deaths of thousands of people. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "What are you studying?" "Oh, I'm in the communications track. I want to be a journalist, maybe cover interplanetary politics." "My parents think it's too dangerous, especially after the war. But I think it's important for people to understand what's happening in the galaxy." There was something almost touching about Kira's enthusiasm for a career that Sarah knew would probably involve more bureaucratic meetings than exciting adventures. But she didn't want to discourage the girl's dreams. "It's important work," Sarah said simply. They returned to their room as the sun was setting over the lake. Kira immediately threw herself onto her bed and pulled out her phone, beginning what appeared to be a detailed conversation with someone about her famous roommate. Sarah sat at her desk and opened her tablet to review her class assignments for the following day. Calculus, galactic history, comparative literature, chemistry, and something called social dynamics. Sarah stared at the last item, wondering what that could possibly involve. In her experience, social dynamics usually meant figuring out which admiral was trying to undermine your authority and which alien ambassador was lying through their teeth. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on her first day at Riverside Academy. The challenges were different from anything she had faced before, but they were no less real. She had spent 15 years learning how to command respect through competence and authority. Now she had to learn how to fit in with people who had never faced real consequences for their decisions. But Sarah Chen had not become the youngest fleet commander in human history by backing down from difficult situations. If the Education Council wanted her to complete high school, then she would complete high school. If her classmates wanted to see her as either a celebrity or a freak, she would deal with that too. After all, she had faced down the combined might of the Zephyrian Empire. How hard could teenage social politics possibly be? Sarah's first week at Riverside Academy taught her that teenage social politics were considerably more complex than interstellar warfare. At least when Zephyrian commanders wanted you dead, they had the courtesy to attack you directly. High school students were far more subtle in their cruelty. It started in calculus class. Mr. Thompson was explaining differential equations when Madison Clark, daughter of the Martian colonial governor, raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, shouldn't we be covering more advanced material? Some of us aren't starting from basic algebra. The comment was delivered with a sweet smile, but Sarah caught the sideways glance in her direction. The message was clear. You don't belong here with us smart kids. Sarah had designed orbital mechanics calculations for fleet formations that involved hundreds of ships moving in three-dimensional space while accounting for gravitational fields, enemy fire patterns, and fuel consumption rates. Differential equations were not the problem. The problem was that Madison Clark represented something Sarah had never encountered in the military, an enemy who attacked through social manipulation rather than honest conflict. After class, Sarah approached Madison directly. In her experience, confronting problems head-on usually worked. "Is there something you wanted to say to me?" Sarah asked. Madison's perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light as she tilted her head in mock confusion. "I'm sorry. I was just concerned about our class pace. We all want to succeed, don't we?" "Of course," Sarah replied, studying the girl's face. Madison had the kind of practiced innocence that reminded Sarah of certain diplomatic envoys who smiled while planning your destruction. "I appreciate your concern for my education." Madison's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure you'll catch up eventually. Military training must be so different from real academic work." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in enough politeness to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising, the same cold fury she had experienced when enemy commanders underestimated her because of her age. But here, she couldn't respond with tactical superiority or overwhelming firepower. She had to play by different rules entirely. "I'm sure I'll manage," Sarah said simply, then walked away. The pattern repeated throughout her first week. In galactic history, Trevor Kim questioned whether Sarah's military perspective might be too biased for objective analysis. In comparative literature, Stephanie Walsh wondered aloud if someone who had only read technical manuals could really understand classical poetry. Each attack was carefully crafted to sound like legitimate academic concern, while actually being designed to establish that Sarah didn't belong in their intellectual circle. The social dynamics class proved to be the worst. Professor Laurent, a thin man with an advanced degree in psychology, had decided that Sarah's presence offered a unique learning opportunity. "Today we're going to discuss the challenges of social reintegration," he announced. "Miss Chen, perhaps you could share your experiences transitioning from military to civilian life?" Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of being treated like a case study. 25 pairs of eyes stared at her expectantly, waiting for her to bare her soul for their academic edification. "It's an ongoing process," she said carefully. "But surely there must be specific challenges?" Professor Laurent pressed. "The literature suggests that individuals with extensive combat experience often struggle with normal social interactions. Do you find yourself having difficulty relating to your peers?" The question was inappropriate on multiple levels. But Sarah recognized that refusing to answer would make things worse. "Every transition involves adjustments," she said neutrally. Madison Clark raised her hand. "Professor, isn't there also research about how military training can make people more aggressive? Should we be concerned about safety?" The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah felt her cybernetic hand clench involuntarily, the servos making a faint whirring sound. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Professor Laurent looked pleased with the direction of the discussion. "That's an excellent question, Miss Clark. Miss Chen, how do you manage aggressive impulses in a civilian environment?" Sarah stared at the professor for a long moment, feeling the weight of every decision she had made, every life she had been responsible for. Every night she had lain awake wondering if there had been another way. These people had no idea what they were talking about. They threw around words like aggression and combat experience, as if they were abstract concepts to be analyzed rather than realities that left scars on your soul. I don't have aggressive impulses to manage, she said quietly. Aggression is a luxury for people who don't understand the real cost of violence. The classroom went silent. Professor Laurent looked like he had bitten into something unexpected and unpleasant. Madison Clark's smug expression faltered slightly. Violence is never the answer in civilized society, Laurent said, recovering his composure. No, Sarah agreed, but sometimes it's the only question that matters. When someone is trying to kill innocent people, you don't get to choose whether violence occurs, you only get to choose who survives. The discussion moved on to safer topics after that, but Sarah noticed that several students avoided eye contact with her for the rest of class. She was being categorized again, filed away as something dangerous and unpredictable. The only bright spot in her academic life was chemistry class. Professor Rodriguez was a former research scientist who had worked on the terraforming projects, and she treated Sarah like any other student. The work was genuinely challenging, involving molecular engineering concepts that pushed beyond Sarah's military technical training. For the first time since arriving at Riverside, Sarah felt like she was actually learning something useful. Your approach to problem solving is interesting, Professor Rodriguez commented after Sarah had solved a particularly complex equation involving atmospheric processing. Very systematic. Where did you learn to break down problems that way? Target analysis protocols, Sarah replied without thinking. When you're trying to identify weaknesses in enemy defensive systems, you have to approach the problem methodically. Professor Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. Same principle applies to molecular structures. Everything has a weak point if you know how to look for it. It was the first time a teacher had acknowledged that Sarah's military experience might actually be relevant to academic work. Sarah found herself looking forward to chemistry class in a way she hadn't expected. Unfortunately, her success in chemistry only seemed to increase the hostility from certain classmates. Madison Clark began making pointed comments about grade inflation and whether military students should be held to the same standards as everyone else. Trevor Kim started a rumor that Sarah was receiving classified tutoring from government scientists. The attacks were always indirect, always carefully constructed to avoid direct confrontation. Sarah's breaking point came during lunch on Friday. She was sitting with Kira and a few other students who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her rather than scoring social points. The conversation was actually pleasant, focusing on weekend plans and an upcoming cultural festival. Madison Clark approached their table with her usual entourage of followers. Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm curious about something. Sarah tensed, recognizing the predatory gleam in Madison's eyes. What is it? Well, I was talking to my father yesterday, and he mentioned that there's been some criticism about the military's conduct during the war. Something about civilian casualties during the Europa operation. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. The question hit like a plasma bolt to the chest. Europa had been Sarah's greatest victory and her greatest failure. She had saved the colony, but the final assault had resulted in the deaths of 43 civilians who had been used as human shields by the Zephyrian forces. Sarah had reviewed the tactical recordings 1,000 times, looking for any other option she might have taken. The conclusion was always the same. If she hadn't ordered the attack, all 30,000 colonists would have died. But knowing you made the right decision didn't make it hurt less. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements precise and controlled. The cafeteria began to quiet as other students sensed the tension. 43 people died during the Europa liberation, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. I remember all their names. I've read their family histories. I know what they wanted to be when they grew up. Madison's confident expression began to waver. She had expected to score an easy point, not to face this level of intensity. That's very sad, Madison stammered. But surely you understand that people have questions about military accountability. I understand, Sarah continued, taking a step closer. I understand that you think this is a game. You think you can score points by asking painful questions about things you don't comprehend. You think that because we're in a school setting, the normal rules of human decency don't apply. The cafeteria was completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped what they were doing to listen. I also understand, Sarah said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, that you have never in your entire privileged life been responsible for anything more important than your own grades. You have never had to choose between bad options and worse ones. You have never held the hand of a dying soldier who was younger than you are now. You have certainly never had to explain to 30,000 people why their friends and family members had to die so that they could live. Madison was backing away now, her face pale. I was just... You were just... what? Sarah stepped forward again, matching Madison's retreat. Just trying to hurt me for your own entertainment? Just demonstrating how much smarter and more morally superior you are? Just proving that you can ask questions about classified military operations in front of your friends? Stop, Madison whispered. Gladly. Sarah's voice returned to normal volume. When you apologize for using the deaths of innocent people as ammunition for your petty social games. Madison looked around the cafeteria, clearly hoping for support from her friends or intervention from the staff. But no one moved. The raw emotion in Sarah's voice had stripped away all the carefully constructed social conventions that usually governed these interactions. I'm sorry, Madison said quietly. Sarah nodded once, then turned and walked out of the cafeteria. Behind her, conversations slowly resumed, but she could feel hundreds of eyes following her exit. She found herself in the Academy's Memorial Garden, a quiet space dedicated to alumni who had died in various conflicts over the past 2 centuries. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was hiding among memorials to dead soldiers because she couldn't handle the social pressures of high school. Kira found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on a bench beneath a plaque commemorating graduates who had died in the Titan mining revolt. That was intense, Kira said, settling down beside her. I shouldn't have lost control, Sarah replied. Are you kidding? Madison totally deserved that. She's been gunning for you all week. Sarah shook her head. In the military, you maintain discipline no matter what the provocation. Losing your temper gets people killed. This isn't the military, Kira pointed out. And Madison isn't a Zephyrian commander. She's just a spoiled brat who's jealous that someone more accomplished than her is sharing her spotlight. How do you handle it? Sarah asked. How do you deal with people who attack you just because they can? Kira was quiet for a moment. I guess I never really thought about it that way. I mean, high school drama is just drama. It doesn't really matter in the long run. But Sarah was beginning to understand that it did matter, at least here. In this environment, social standing determined everything from which study groups you could join to how teachers treated your contributions in class. Madison Clark wasn't just being cruel for entertainment. She was systematically working to isolate Sarah and undermine her academic success. She's not going to stop, Sarah said. Probably not, Kira agreed. Madison doesn't like being upstaged, and you, my friend, are pretty much the definition of upstaging. Sarah spent the weekend thinking about strategy. She had always been good at analyzing enemy capabilities and developing countermeasures. Madison Clark was an enemy, just a different kind than she was used to facing. The girl's weapons were social influence, family connections, and the ability to manipulate academic environments to her advantage. But every enemy had weaknesses. Monday morning brought a new challenge. Sarah arrived at her locker to find that someone had taped a printed article to the door. The headline read, Military Accountability in the Europa Campaign, Questions that Demand Answers. It was a piece from a fringe political blog that had been critical of military conduct during the war. Several students were clustered nearby, watching for Sarah's reaction. Madison Clark was among them, trying to look innocent, while clearly waiting to see if her latest attack had found its mark. Sarah removed the article without reading it, and placed it carefully in her bag. Then she opened her locker and retrieved her books as if nothing had happened. The watching students gradually dispersed, disappointed by the lack of dramatic reaction. But Sarah was learning. If Madison wanted to play these games, then Sarah would have to become better at playing them than her opponent. She had spent 15 years mastering the art of war. How difficult could it be to master the art of high school politics? The answer, she was beginning to realize, was more difficult than she had ever imagined. Because in war, at least the rules were clear. You protected your people and defeated your enemies. In high school, the rules seemed to change constantly, and sometimes the people you were trying to protect were also the ones attacking you. Still, Sarah Chen had not survived 15 years of interstellar warfare by giving up when things got complicated. If Madison Clark wanted a fight, she was about to discover that she had chosen the wrong opponent. Sarah's counterattack began with intelligence gathering. She spent 2 weeks observing Madison Clark's social network, identifying key relationships and influence patterns. In the military, you never engaged an enemy without understanding their supply lines, command structure, and strategic objectives. High school politics operated on similar principles, just with different resources. Madison's power base rested on 3 pillars: her family's political connections, her role as student council president, and her ability to control social dynamics through gossip and exclusion. Sarah needed to understand each weakness before she could exploit them. The opportunity came during a joint presentation in Galactic history class. Professor Martinez had assigned teams to analyze different aspects of the recent war, and through careful maneuvering, Sarah had managed to get paired with David Park, Madison's boyfriend, and the son of a prominent military contractor. David was actually intelligent when separated from Madison's influence, and he had access to declassified military records through his father's connections. As they worked together in the library, Sarah began to understand how the civilian leadership had viewed the conflict. "I never realized how much political pressure there was on the military command," David admitted as they reviewed documents about the Europa campaign. "My father said the Joint Chiefs were getting contradictory orders from 3 different government committees. That's why operational autonomy is so important," Sarah explained. "When politicians try to micromanage tactical decisions from light years away, people die." David looked uncomfortable. "Madison says that military commanders should be held accountable for their decisions. Madison has never been accountable for anything more significant than her student council budget," Sarah replied. "It's easy to demand accountability when you've never had to make decisions where every option results in someone's death." She could see David processing this information, comparing it to whatever version of events Madison had been feeding him. Sarah recognized the look. She had seen it on junior officers who were beginning to understand that the simplified scenarios they had trained with didn't reflect the complexity of real combat. Their presentation went well. Sarah provided the tactical analysis while David covered the political context. Professor Martinez seemed impressed by their thoroughness, and even Madison couldn't find fault with their research without looking petty. But Sarah's real victory came after class, when David approached her privately. "Can I ask you something? About Europa, I mean." Sarah nodded, though she braced herself for another painful question. "The official records show that you requested civilian evacuation 3 times before the final assault, but the transport ships couldn't get through the Zephyrian blockade. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. David was quiet for a moment. "So you did everything possible to avoid civilian casualties?" "I did everything I could think of. That doesn't mean it was enough." But Madison said you never even tried to find alternatives to military action. Sarah felt a cold anger settle in her stomach. Madison hadn't just been attacking her personally. She had been spreading false information about classified military operations. That crossed a line from school politics into something more serious. Madison wasn't there, Sarah said carefully. She doesn't have access to operational records. Where did she get her information? David looked increasingly uncomfortable. I'm not sure. She said she had sources. Sarah spent that evening researching Madison's father, Governor Clark of the Mars Colonial Authority. What she found was illuminating. During the war, Clark had been one of the civilian officials demanding faster military action against Zephyrian forces, often without regard for tactical realities or civilian safety. His political career had been built on criticizing military hesitation and demanding more aggressive strategies. The irony was perfect. Madison had been attacking Sarah for decisions that her own father had helped force her to make. Sarah's next move was carefully calculated. She arranged to give a guest lecture in Professor Martinez's Advanced History Seminar, a class that included several of Madison's closest allies. The topic was civilian-military relations during wartime, and Sarah had prepared thoroughly. She began with general principles, discussing the tension between political objectives and tactical realities. Then she moved to specific case studies from the recent war, including detailed analysis of several controversial decisions. Throughout the presentation, she maintained strict objectivity, never mentioning individual politicians by name. But the students were smart enough to recognize the patterns she was describing. When Sarah discussed a case where civilian leadership demanded immediate action against a fortified enemy position without allowing time for proper reconnaissance, everyone in the room knew she was talking about the disaster at Ceres Station, where Governor Clark's pressure for quick results had led to heavy casualties. The fundamental challenge, Sarah concluded, is that civilian leaders are accountable to their constituents every few years, while military commanders are accountable for their decisions every single day. This creates different incentives for risk assessment. During the question period, Madison's friend Jennifer raised her hand. But surely military commanders bear responsibility for the outcomes of their decisions? Absolutely, Sarah agreed. The question is whether we hold them responsible for the consequences of their own choices or for the consequences of constraints imposed by people who don't understand the tactical situation. Jennifer looked confused. What do you mean? Sarah brought up a holographic display showing the Europa battlefield. During the liberation, military command requested permission to use orbital bombardment to disable Zephyrian defensive positions. This would have eliminated the need for ground assault and reduced the risk to both military personnel and civilian hostages. The request was denied by civilian oversight because orbital bombardment was considered too aggressive for the political climate. She manipulated the display to show alternative scenarios. Given the available options, which decision would you have made? Ground assault with higher casualty risk but better political optics, or orbital bombardment with lower overall casualties but worse public relations? The room was silent as students struggled with the implications. Sarah had just demonstrated that the civilian casualties at Europa might have been prevented, if not for political interference from officials like Governor Clark. Madison herself attended Sarah's next presentation in the Advanced Tactics Seminar. Sarah could see her taking notes furiously, clearly looking for any mistake or inconsistency she could exploit. But Sarah had learned her lesson about enemy intelligence. Every fact in her presentation was documented, every tactical decision was justified with mathematical analysis, and every alternative scenario was explored in detail. When Madison finally asked a question, her voice carried a dangerous edge. Commander Chen, don't you think it's convenient to blame civilian leaders for military failures? Isn't that just avoiding responsibility? Sarah had been expecting this attack. Governor Clark, Do you think military commanders should ignore civilian oversight? I'm sorry? Madison looked confused by the sudden use of her father's title. You're asking whether military commanders should accept responsibility for following civilian orders, even when those orders lead to preventable casualties. Your father was one of the civilian officials who issued those orders, so I'm asking you directly, should military commanders have ignored your father's directives? Madison's face went white as the implication sank in. Sarah had just publicly connected Madison's family to the controversial decisions that Madison herself had been using to attack Sarah's record. That's not what I meant, Madison stammered. Then perhaps you could clarify what you did mean? Sarah's voice was perfectly polite, but her eyes were cold as space. Madison looked around the room, clearly hoping for support, but found only interested faces waiting for her answer. She had been caught in the logical trap that Sarah had spent weeks preparing. I think this discussion has gotten off track, Madison said weakly. On the contrary, Sarah replied. I think we're finally addressing the real issues. The question isn't whether military commanders should be held accountable. The question is whether that accountability should extend to decisions they weren't allowed to make. The seminar ended with Madison's influence significantly damaged. Students who had previously accepted her version of events were now questioning what they had been told. David Park looked particularly troubled as he left the classroom, but Sarah's real victory came 3 days later, when Principal Morrison called her to his office. She expected another lecture about fitting in or perhaps complaints about her confrontational presentation style. Instead, she found Morrison sitting with a woman she didn't recognize. Commander Chen, this is Dr. Elizabeth Harper from the University of Geneva's Military History Department. She attended your presentation yesterday. Dr. Harper stood and shook Sarah's hand. Commander, I wanted to discuss an opportunity with you. We're developing a new program in contemporary military studies, and we need someone with your experience to help design the curriculum. Sarah blinked in surprise. I'm not qualified to design university curricula. I haven't even finished high school yet. Academic credentials are important, Dr. Harper agreed, but practical experience is irreplaceable. We're looking for someone who can bridge the gap between theoretical military studies and actual operational realities. Your presentations have demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking we need. Principal Morrison leaned forward. Dr. Harper has proposed an alternative path for completing your education. You would finish your remaining high school requirements through accelerated independent study while simultaneously beginning undergraduate coursework in military history and strategic studies. If you perform well, you could transition directly into a graduate program focused on contemporary conflict analysis. Sarah felt a surge of hope that she hadn't experienced since arriving at Riverside. What about the Education Council's requirements? Satisfied, Morrison said. You would still complete your formal education, just through a different pathway, one that's better suited to your background and future goals. As Sarah considered the offer, she realized that her conflict with Madison Clark had accomplished something unexpected. By forcing her to articulate and defend her military experiences in an academic context, Madison had helped Sarah discover what she actually wanted to do with her civilian life. Her final week at Riverside Academy passed quickly. Madison made no further attempts at confrontation, apparently having learned that Sarah was not an opponent she could defeat through social manipulation. David Park approached Sarah privately to apologize for his girlfriend's behavior and to thank her for helping him understand the complexities of civilian-military relations. Even Professor Laurent, who had initially treated Sarah like a psychological case study, seemed to have gained new respect for her perspective. I may have misjudged the complexity of your situation, he admitted. Your insights about decision-making under extreme pressure have been valuable additions to our discussions. On her last day, Sarah was packing her belongings when Kira burst into their room with her usual enthusiasm. I can't believe you're leaving, just when things were getting interesting. Sarah smiled at her energetic roommate. You made this place bearable. I'm grateful for that. Are you going to miss it? Any of it? Sarah considered the question. I learned something important here. I thought the challenge would be adjusting to a civilian environment, but that wasn't really the problem. The problem was that I was trying to fit into someone else's definition of what my life should look like. Kira nodded thoughtfully. Madison never stood a chance, did she? I mean, she was playing high school games while you were thinking 3 moves ahead. She wasn't evil, Sarah said, just limited. She couldn't imagine a world where her father might have been wrong, so she attacked anyone who threatened that worldview. Very diplomatic. You're going to do great in university. As Sarah carried her bag toward the transport that would take her to her new life, she reflected on what she had learned during her brief time at Riverside Academy. Combat had prepared her for obvious enemies and clear objectives, but civilian life required different skills. The ability to navigate complex social relationships, to communicate effectively with people who had never faced real consequences for their decisions, and to find purpose in a world where the missions weren't handed down from military command. Madison Clark was waiting by the transport platform, apparently having anticipated Sarah's departure time. She looked nervous but determined. I wanted to apologize, Madison said. Properly, I mean. Not because you forced me to in front of everyone. Sarah studied the girl's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but Madison seemed genuinely uncomfortable, suggesting this was real. Apology accepted, Sarah said. I also wanted to ask, do you think I could visit your new program sometime? I mean, I know I've been horrible to you, but listening to your presentations made me realize how little I actually know about the war, about what really happened. Sarah was surprised by the request, but she could see something genuine in Madison's expression. Perhaps being forced to confront the complexity of the decisions her father had made had shaken some of her certainty about the world. The program will have guest lecture opportunities, Sarah said. I'll make sure you receive information about them. Madison looked relieved. Thank you. And Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you're going to change how people think about military history. You make it real in a way that textbooks can't. As the transport lifted off, Sarah watched Riverside Academy shrink below her. She had survived high school, though not in the way anyone had expected. More importantly, she had discovered that her military experience wasn't something to be overcome or apologized for. It was a perspective that civilian institutions needed, a way of thinking about problems and solutions that could bridge the gap between academic theory and practical reality. The war had ended, but Sarah Chen was far from finished serving humanity. She was just getting started on a different kind of mission, one that would require all the strategic thinking, tactical analysis, and leadership skills she had developed in combat. The battlefield had changed, but the core mission remained the same: protecting people and making sure their sacrifices meant something. And if she had learned anything from her time at Riverside Academy, it was that civilian life could be just as challenging as military service. It just required different weapons and different strategies to achieve victory.